So Doyle thought that that was it. But then there was such a fan uproar that eventually Doyle and the managing editors at the Strand realized that Holmes needed to be brought back. And so Hound of the Baskervilles came out, and that was a flashback story. And Doyle hoped that that would be enough to whet the fans' appetite, but when it wasn't, Holmes was forced to pick up his pen and say, okay, I'm going to write ongoing stories. And so he wrote the story, The Adventure of the Empty House, in which Holmes made his way back to England and surprised Watson. His explanation was that he had survived the fall at Reichenbach Falls, and so he picked himself up. He realized that some of Moriarty's men were still on the loose, and so he had to lie low, but he narrowed it down to one of Moriarty's henchmen who was still running loose, and so Holmes hatched a trap for his final Moriarty associate, who was caught at the end of the story, meaning that Holmes was free to go back to his work as a consulting detective at 221B Baker Street. And from there, Doyle wrote Holmes stories for a certain number of years after that. But again, Professor Moriarty wasn't a character who popped up in any more Sherlock Holmes stories. The reason why Moriarty has become such an iconic character is because of the work of all of the other women and men who have written Sherlock Holmes stories and contributed to the mythology. Probably the best example I can think of is the sentient Moriarty hologram from Star Trek, The Next Generation. But now, moving past that, as to why I'm wondering whether Moriarty is a real character in the Victorian Ford universe or whether he's an hallucination on Holmes's part, this speaks to an interesting fan theory about Sherlock Holmes. And basically, the fan theory is that within Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes universe, Sherlock Holmes was Jack the Ripper. Nobody's suggesting that in the real world Sherlock Holmes was Jack the Ripper. This fan theory states that within the Sherlock Holmes universe there was a Jack the Ripper. And so here's how the theory goes. So at the start of the ongoing Sherlock Holmes stories, Dr. Watson has moved out of 221B Baker Street because he's now married. And Holmes resents that. He sees Watson's wife as being the woman who took his best friend away, despite the fact that Watson would come for regular visits and go with Holmes in order to chronicle all of Holmes's adventures. Holmes had this deep-seated resentment towards Mrs. Watson, and over time, Holmes's resentment grew into resentment against all women to the point that he started going out and killing innocent women at night. And given his knowledge of medical practices, it's not too much of a stretch to agree that Sherlock Holmes would be able to inflict the sort of injuries that Jack the Ripper inflicted upon his victims. Now, the fan theory continues that at a point, Holmes realized that he had become this awful, monstrous being, and he decided that the only way to stop what he was doing was to kill himself. So he concocted this character of Professor Moriarty, led Watson on this goose chase for an entirely fictional character, and then set things up so that Watson would think that Holmes had actually engaged in battle with another man at the top of a cliff and had fallen to his death, when in reality, Holmes committed suicide. He jumped off the cliff, and that letter that Watson found at the base of the cliff was actually a suicide letter. Now, the fan theory continues to state that Holmes miraculously survived the fall, off the cliff, picked himself up, realized he was alive, and said, "I've been reborn. I've been given another chance. I can go back to my old life. I'm not going to hurt anyone else ever again." And so he returns after a couple of years of convalescence and makes up the story that uh, he's having to be careful because there's one more associate who's still after him. And the fan theory suggests that this associate, who eventually gets arrested by Inspector Lestrade, was simply paid off by Holmes, and so maybe Lestrade was paid to go along with this act. So that makes me wonder here in this story. I'm not suggesting that Sam feels that Holmes was Jack the Ripper, but I just wonder here in this story, when Holmes is battling Moriarty inside the monster's body, is Moriarty even there, or is he just an effect of Holmes falling to his death and having his brain transplanted inside a body that was not created through entirely natural means? So Sam, a bit of homework for you over summer, my friend, something for you to think about, and we'll talk about when we meet again. Now, in terms of the artwork, Matt Tavares is the artist on the Victorian 4, and my goodness, is his artwork beautiful. This is black and white interior art, like all of Sam's other published works, but it's fine because you really get to appreciate Matt's pencil and artwork. There's this real dynamic movement, like when Booth transforms into a werewolf, and you feel like Booth as the werewolf is going to leap off the page right at you. I love how he's capturing the mannerisms of the characters. Like, you look at President Lincoln, the way he carries himself, his body language, and that feels like how Lincoln should carry himself. Holmes is not walking around with his arms stretched out. He's not plodding around. He's actually moving like Sherlock Holmes did in his life before having his brain transplanted into a monster's body. So clearly Matt's been doing his homework on the characters who he is portraying visually. Matt is also a very versatile artist. I've seen his art for other things which he's collaborated on with Sam, and for some of those works he's had a more cartoony style, but that's because it really fits the tone of those stories. But here with the Victorian 4, where it's steampunk and it's action, Matt's got this really great art style that tells you it's a serious story, but there's a lot of action, so it's really fun. And what I really appreciate is that between the 0 and the number 1 issues, Matt's actually pulled back the curtain and he's shown us sketches showing the process he's taken in modifying the looks of different characters, because you'll notice from the 0 issue to the 1 issue, Holmes looks different. Mary Curie looks different. I just really appreciate when an artist lets us in and lets us see their process, how they're considering, reflecting upon their work, and then changing it so that they feel more satisfied. And so that makes us feel really satisfied in the end, and that we're getting a piece of great comic art that hasn't just been slapped together. There's been a lot of creative thought put into the work. And the covers for these issues are in full color, and really eye-catching too. So if you're able to get print copies of the Victorian 4, I would say go for it. And I would hope that at some point there's going to be a collected edition maybe after 5 or 6 issues, I'll be certain to pick up a copy of a first trade. So all in all, the Victorian 4 is a really, really enjoyable piece of work. This is the first steampunk story I've ever read, and it's inspired me to try to pick up some other steampunk tales in the future. Sam and Matt have done a brilliant job through the first 3 issues, and I cannot wait for issue number 3 to come out. So please do check the Comics and History Facebook page for a link to websites where you can get at least digital copies or order print copies of the Victorian 4. You'll certainly be glad that you invested your time in this story. All right, folks, in the last 3 and a bit minutes that I've got left on the timer, it is the start of summer, and compared to other years, this is one summer where I'm probably not going to have as much time for podcasting as I would like. And there's a very good reason for that. Victoria is turning 3 next month, and she's at the stage where she has no interest in watching her daddy speak into the phone to bring you these recordings. She wants to get out early in the morning and stay out as long as she can, and who can blame a child for wanting to enjoy the summer? Plus, given that I'm no doubt going to have some administrative responsibilities to take care of school-wise over the summer. Long story short, folks, if you don't get another episode of Comics and History in 2 weeks or even 3 weeks, don't panic. The show's not going away. It's not getting shut down. It just means that I'm not going to have time to record as much as I would like. It's going to be tough for me to record episodes and then put them in the proverbial can. So I'm going to record whenever I can, and then as soon as I can, I will post my usual Monday release dates. But I can tell you that with episode number 119, I'll be launching a new Spotlight series. I will be shining the spotlight on the Spectre, the great DC Comics character, with a special shout out to fellow podcaster Ed Moore for suggesting the idea on his other website. So I'll be, in addition to talk about the Spectre and the Golden Age, I'll also be talking a bit about Ed Moore and some of the really great podcasts which he hosts or co-hosts. If you want to get in touch with me, you can email me at comicsandhistory@gmail.com or shoot me a line at the Comics and History Facebook page. Alrighty, folks. Until we meet again for episode number 119, this class is dismissed.